Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Health Australia Party. I'm Molly, and tonight we're going to be talking about medicinal cannabis. And to guide us through this, we'll be talking to Professor Kylie O'Brien. Kylie is the Director of Education at the Australasian College of Nutritional and Environmental Medicine. She's an internationally recognised expert in Chinese medicine and integrative medicine, and she's published extensively, including a first book on integrative oncology back in 2017, and she has a second one due out later this year, perhaps early next year, on mental health and medicinal cannabis. So that's something to look for. Kylie's a member of the TGA Advisory Committee for Complementary Medicine, and so she really wears quite a few hats. Welcome, Kylie. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, pleasure, Molly.
So we're going to talk about medicinal cannabis. So let's just jump straight in. And I'm interested to know what got you interested in medicinal cannabis.
Look, it's interesting because I've got a background for the last 20 years as a Chinese medicine academic and researcher. And a colleague of mine, Professor Ian Pridehope, came to me when I was working at the National Institute of Integrative Medicine a few years ago and said, look, medicinal cannabis can be prescribed legally in the country, but there's not much in terms of education around it. And there's no pathway for doctors to become authorised prescribers of it. So, having an interest and expertise in education, I put together some training courses, a 2-day course in medicinal cannabis, which received RACGP approval for continuing professional development purposes. And we ran that a couple of times in the year. And I also helped set up for doctors to become authorised prescribers of medicinal cannabis. And I'll talk perhaps a bit more later about that. But basically, you have to go through an ethics committee. I happened to be chairing the ethics committee at the time. And so I set up the process by which doctors could go through the NIM ethics committee. And then if approved there, they could be approved, but then go on to apply to the TGA to become approved prescribers. So I guess it was really just, Professor Brightope coming and saying, we've got an issue. I didn't know much about medicinal cannabis back then, a few years ago. That certainly changed. I have to say, being a herbal medicine practitioner as well, I've never become more fascinated with a herb than I have with medicinal cannabis.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because as a herbalist myself, we have, a couple of thousand herbs we can choose from, really, or plants. And it's interesting that this one has really spoken to you. So, Kylie, can you tell me how cannabis, the medicinal cannabis, is different from what most people think of, or I think of, as the drug we call marijuana? Is it different, or are we looking at the same plant?
Well, cannabis and marijuana are the same plant. So the species is Cannabis sativa. It's got two main subspecies indica and subspecies sativa. So they tend to use the word marijuana a lot in the US, and it's often, can be used to refer to cannabis smoked recreationally or adult use. Whereas in Australia, we tend to use the word cannabis, whether or not we're talking about recreational use or medicinal use. Another I think term that people tend to get a bit confused about is also hemp. Now, hemp is just a strain of cannabis with very low levels of tetrahydrocannabinol or THC, and that's the one component of cannabis that can be potentially intoxicating, as in it's associated with a high, when people smoke it recreationally. So hemp has got an upper limit in the US of less than or equal to 0.3%. Whereas in Europe it's a bit low, it's less than or equal to 0.2%. So hemp varieties of the plant tend to be much taller, and they're bred for their fibre, because they use the stalks and the leaves predominantly. And they're used in industry, so they can be used for clothing or ropes and plastic substitutes. They've been used as making bricks, for example, in the building industry. And even if you look under the bonnet of a Mercedes-Benz, apparently some of the components are actually made from hemp, which is something I learned from a colleague when I was giving a talk in Borneo a couple of years ago. But, we see the hemp seeds in our supermarkets, don't we? And health food shops and things like that. So the hemp seeds have been used for foods for eons, for humans as well as livestock. And they're a growing part of the nutraceutical and cosmeceutical industries. So you can get hemp, shampoo and hemp-based, skincare products, that sort of things. But hemp seed doesn't have the phytocannabinoids in it, like THC and cannabidiol, CBD, which I'll talk about in a moment. But they do have a lot of other healthy nutrients, and they've got a great balance of omega-6 and omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids. So they've got some health benefits as well. Just to make things even more confusing, though, in the US, they are using flowers and buds from hemp varieties to make hemp-based cannabidiol or CBD medicinal cannabis products. So often it can be very confusing, but, essentially hemp seeds are a food and you can't get high from them.
Okay, yeah, I'm a great fan of hemp because I think the uses of it are so extensive and it's undervalued really for its use in industry and building houses. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
So which parts of the plant are used to make our oil, the medicinal oil?
So it's the dried flowers or buds of the unfertilized female plant that's used to make cannabis oil, medicinal cannabis. So you've got little florets of the flower, and they've got little glandular structures on them called trichomes, and it's in there that the plant phytocannabinoids are stored, as well as the terpenes. And the terpenes are the essential oils that give the plant its characteristic smell. So if it's got a lot of alpha-pinene, it'll smell like pine needles, that sort of thing. So a lot of people don't realise that cannabis has probably got over 700 chemical constituents. And you've got some main classes. So one of the main classes is called the phyto or plant cannabinoids. And there are about 120 of these in 11 main classes. But then you've got the terpenes, and there's over 200 of those, but they're not specific just to cannabis. So lots of plants have terpenes in them. And then you've got lots of other plant nutrients, and all these terpenes and these other nutrients provide what they call an entourage effect. So the entourage effect just means that they contribute to the overall therapeutic effect of those main phytocannabinoids. But I guess it's like that 70s ad in years ago, oils ain't oils. So that's sort of showing my age a bit, but there are hundreds of different cannabis strains, and each has got its own chemical profile, and that basically means it describes the amount of those various cannabinoids and terpenes and in what relative amounts they are. So we've got many, many different strains of the plant cannabis. So cannabis is not one thing, in other words.
So is it vitally important which particular plant they use then? Which
strain?
Family or strain? Yeah,
it is, because there are, not only do we have the main, phytocannabinoids, which are THC and CBD, cannabidiol, but they've got many other phytocannabinoids, and they can have therapeutic effects on the body as well. And as I said, the terpenes can also, they have their own therapeutic effects. So when you combine them all, yes, some strains are, maybe a bit more sedating than others, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're at a relatively early stage in the development of this in Australia. I certainly think that there's probably a lot more known about this in the US, where they use it a lot more commonly, I guess, and that it's been, I think 32 states allow the medicinal use, and about 12, I think, allow recreational use. So I think we've got a lot more to learn about the actual strains and which ones might be better for different conditions.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Do we grow the cannabis here that we use, or is it imported? Do you know? Most
of it at this point is being imported in our medicinal cannabis products, but various groups or companies are growing now in Australia. So yes, that industry is starting to develop quite well, I think.
Yeah, lovely. Another new industry for us. That's great. Yeah. So how is medicinal cannabis different, really?
Well, I guess I define medicinal cannabis as cannabis or cannabis products used specifically to treat illness and or promote wellness, and ideally prescribed by a qualified healthcare professional and individualised to the patient, like any other herbal medicine is really. And I use that sort of to distinguish it from recreational use. Now, the raw herb or the raw buds can be smoked for medicinal purposes, and that's, you know, reasonably common in the US. But if we talk about proprietary forms of medicinal cannabis products, like the ones that, you know, we can get in Australia, there's probably three main categories. So the first one is what they call cannabis botanicals. So they're dense whole plant extracts, and they've got the phytocannabinoids and the terpenes and other phytonutrients. Then you've got cannabis-based extracts. So these products are like nabiximols. So that's a plant-derived 1-to-1 ratio of just THC and CBD. And then you've got the third class, which are synthetic cannabinoids. So they've been basically isolated one of the molecules like THC and synthetically copied it. So there's a couple of drugs on the market called Nabilone and Dronabinol, and they're FDA approved in the US. So they're, you know, the main classes. And I guess if we look at what forms are available in Australia, well, typically at the moment, we've got oils in bottles for oral use. We've got some companies have oils in capsules. And there's a few variations on this. So there's one company that has a sublingual wafer, which dissolves under your tongue very quickly, and that's just CBD only. You've got others that have got oral mucosal sprays, and some companies have got the dried buds available as well. You can also get suppositories and topical use products in other countries, you know, like creams and salves for external use, but I don't know of any on the market, certainly in the legal market here in Australia at the moment. So I suspect that you know, they'll come along fairly soon, I would think, at least the topical use ones anyway. And I think the thing to remember is that in the US, medicinal use also does include smoking it and vaping it, using a vaping device. And they've also got other things, like they've got cannabis edibles like cookies and gummies, which I think can be problematic because they're a relatively unregulated market over there. But we'll talk about the safety perhaps a little bit later.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So something that I'm curious about is, how does it work in the body?
Well,
what does it do that's so special?
Well, interestingly enough, we have got our own, we make our own cannabinoids. We have what's called an endo, or within the body, cannabinoid system. So we make our own endocannabinoids, and the two main ones are called anandamide, and ananda means bliss in Hindi, and 2AG. They're the two main ones, but there are other ones as well. And we've got receptors for these in our brains and all over our bodies, in our organs, our skin, everywhere. So we've got two main receptors. They're called CB1 and CB2 receptors. The CB1 receptors are located in particular in the brain, the central nervous system, but also in other parts of the body, including the organs. And CB2 receptors are located in particular in immune cells, but they're also located in many organs and other parts of the body. And then the third component, so we've got our endocannabinoids, we've got our receptors for them, and then we've got the enzymes that help make the endocannabinoids and help break them down once they've done their job. So why have we got this system in our body? Well, it's to regulate homeostasis, which basically is the balance of nearly every system in our body. So it regulates pain, it regulates the immune system and inflammation, it regulates our emotions and our reaction to stress, our gastrointestinal function, reproduction, development of fetus, brain development, so on and so on. So without going into a lot of detail, when you get a stimulus in the body, like inflammation or pain or even exercise, our endocannabinoids are usually in fairly low levels, but they get manufactured on demand in response to this, and the levels of the body increase, they ramp up. So if we're talking about what happens in nerves, so in the brain, when an endocannabinoid binds to a receptor, it causes changes within that end or terminal of the nerve, that they call that the synapse, and that modifies the release of other neurotransmitters in the body. So it changes their effects on the body. And we've got many, many different neurotransmitters. So THC, the one phytocannabinoid in medicinal cannabis, which is associated with a potentially intoxicating effect, and I say potentially because it's dose dependent, that mimics anandamide. So it's called a partial agonist of CB1 and CB2 receptors. So it basically means it binds to them. And this binding, particularly to the CB1 receptors, is thought to be responsible for many of the therapeutic actions. which include its action as a psychoactive agent, as an analgesic or pain reliever, and a muscle relaxant. So it's got a lot of, I guess, different beneficial actions. So some of those, anti-nausea and vomiting, neuroprotective or nerve protectant actions. It's an antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, analgesic or pain relieving. It stimulates appetite, helps with insomnia, and even anti-aging. So there's some nice research that's been released recently that shows it might have some anti-aging properties.
Sounds good to me.
So that binding of THC with CB1 receptors in the brain, that's also responsible for that high experience when you smoke cannabis. And as I said, that euphoria, if you like, is dose dependent. Now, CBD, the other main phytocannabinoid, cannabidiol, doesn't work in the same way because it doesn't bind very easily to CB1 or CB2 receptors at all. And it's thought to work through other receptors, which are plentiful and many. So, you know, again, it's got actions like analgesic, antiemetic, so it reduces nausea and vomiting, anticonvulsive, so it's used to help suppress seizures, antipsychotic, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, nerve protecting again, anxiolytic, even anti-cancer properties, and many others. So that's essentially how it works, I guess. It's complex.
Yeah. I mean, it's very complex and it covers a huge range of symptoms that it can work with.
Yeah.
Doesn't it? Yeah, I mean, it almost sounds like it could cure almost, well, I don't like the word cure, but it could help any situation.
Yes.
So is the effect of this medicinal cannabis accumulative in the body? Yeah, I mean, can it become toxic, I guess, or does the body break it down easily once its usefulness is finished?
Yeah, well, our endocannabinoids, this is where it's different. In our own body, the endocannabinoids get broken down very quickly after they've done their job. And then the phytocannabinoids can actually stay in the system a lot longer. So, for example, the half-life, which is the time it takes for half the amount to break down of CBD or cannabidiol, is anywhere between 20 and 36 hours. Now, THC likes fat. It's lipophilic. So it penetrates into fat tissues fairly rapidly and also highly vascularized tissues. So vascularization just means got a lot of blood vessels, like the brain, like muscle, that sort of thing. And then it gets slowly redistributed out of these deep fat deposits back into the bloodstream. So the breakdown products of THC can actually stay in the body for, you know, several weeks even. So that's why doctors will medicinal cannabis products containing THC that they shouldn't drive, because it's not as simple as saying, all right, well, I'm going to drive tomorrow, so I'm not going to take my THC containing medicine the day before. It doesn't work like that. It can stay around in your body for days or even weeks. And the problem with that in Australia is that it's an offence under our state and territory driving laws to have to drive with any amount of THC in the body, regardless whether you're intoxicated or not. It doesn't matter whether you've been prescribed medicinal cannabis and you hand over your script or not. It's an offence, and that's problematic at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, potentially, yeah, that could be a definite problem. But addictive? Is it addictive?
Cannabis can be addictive in some people, but not all people, in the same way that some people can get addicted to opioids and other people don't. And that's due to the THC component. So addiction or dependence is really where a person's lost control of the use of it. And they keep using it despite it, you know, causing negative effects and psychosocial problems, that sort of thing. So much of the research is in cannabis dependence or cannabis use disorder is really in recreational use and people who are smoking it. So addiction usually in people who are smoking it daily over long time periods and for non-medical use. There's less research available.
It's just breaking up a little bit, Kylie. Sorry, just can you repeat that? It just broke up a little bit.
That's okay. I was just saying that addiction or dependence is usually in people smoking it daily over long time periods for non-medical use. And there's less research available on people who are just taking it orally, you know, as an oil for medicinal purposes. But look, it is possible if a cannabis medicine's got THC in it, I guess it is possible. And if it was used daily over a long time period, it's possible perhaps that someone could become addicted, just like it is with other medicines. So I guess the use of medicinal cannabis with THC, where it's just used, say, just when needed, so it doesn't necessarily have to be used every day in certain cases, you know, and over relatively short time periods would probably mitigate that possibility. So I guess, you know, theoretically, yes, potentially someone, you know, could become addicted to a prescribed cannabis medicine containing THC, which is probably why it needs to be monitored and prescribed by a qualified medical practitioner. CBD, on the other hand, cannabidiol, is not addictive, and it doesn't convert to THC in the body either. I guess what's probably more problematic, I was having a chat to an addiction medicine specialist, Nick Glenceris, today. He's a research colleague, and we were talking about the problems with cannabis, and he said, look, the more of the problems are more likely with THC withdrawal symptoms. If you, you know, and they're easily managed if you taper off it. If you have to go off it, you taper off, you don't suddenly stop. And, you know, some of those withdrawal symptoms can be sleep disorders and mood problems like being, you know, irritable or anxious. So usually his advice was, you know, usually tapering off over a week or so mitigates these kind of withdrawal symptoms.
And it's the same for quite a few of the prescription drugs. You don't just stop anything, you taper it down, let your body readjust. Yes.
Yeah.
So with this medicinal cannabis, can you overdose on it?
Look, in general, medicinal cannabis is considered relatively safe. And there was a WHO, World Health Organization, report on THC, and they stated that toxicity compared to other recreational and pharmaceutical drugs. But you can overdose on cannabis, and it can lead to some unpleasant side effects due to the THC content. And I guess these, again, are dose related, and, you know, different people would be perhaps more susceptible than others. And again, a lot of the reports, Molly, are on side effects of cannabis and cannabis overdoses, particularly in the US, relate to the recreational use and the smoking of it. And of course, there's been reports of kids being hospitalised because they've got into their, you know, parents' cannabis supplies. But we've got to also remember that the cannabis bred for the recreational market is bred to have very high amounts of THC in it. So remember I said before, oils ain't oils. You can have plants that are bred for very high THC, and they are definitely the ones on the recreational market because that's what people want. And there are products in the US that are very potent in terms of the THC, like dabs and other things. And of course, they've got edibles like cookies and gummies, and it's very difficult to know what the THC content is. So they could be easily overdosed on as well. Their market in the US is relatively unregulated. And I think that's one of our strengths in Australia, is that, you know, we are regulating in a sensible manner. And I guess the other thing is THC can interact with alcohol. So you've got increased likelihood of driving accidents have been reported in the literature there. I guess the other thing, the WHO report stated that the absence of mortality with THC might reflect the low density of these CB1 receptors in the brainstem regions that control cardiovascular and respiratory functions. But I do have to say that I've read some studies in the literature where there's been reports of adverse effects on the heart from overdosing on cannabis, including myocardial infarction and atrial fibrillation when the heart just sort of beats, you know, out of control. So I certainly don't agree when, you know, people say, oh, it's completely safe. So if we look at, you know, perhaps some of the, I mean, look, there's lots of, I guess, information on the side effects of smoking cannabis just recreationally, but
it's just frozen again, Kylie. Sorry, can you just repeat that?
Yeah, okay.
Dropping out a bit.
All right. Look, I'm just saying that there's lots in the literature about side effects of cannabis, but what I wanted to perhaps put across is perhaps more the side effects of cannabis-based medicines. And I guess some of the more common ones you might and fatigue, dizziness, dry mouth, cough, phlegm, bronchitis if it's smoking only. Anxiety, nausea, and some cognitive effects. Other common effects are euphoria, blurred vision, and headache. And some rare ones are what they call orthostatic hypotension, so a drop in blood pressure. More toxic psychosis or paranoia, depression, discoordination, tachycardia, which means increased heart rate, and diarrhea, and cannabis hyperemesis, which is basically, there's not a lot reported in the literature on that, but it's basically uncontrolled vomiting, and people have to jump into a warm shower to, you know, sort of relieve it. So thank goodness that's a rare event. Whereas the side effects associated with CBD in comparison are probably relatively minor. So I was reading one study published last year on CBD, and they looked at the side effects, and they found only a very small percentage of patients actually experienced side effects, and some of those were like sedation, vivid dreams, emotional disturbance, you know, and only 2% or less of the people in the study. The other thing to remember about safety, I suppose, is that both CBD and THC can interact with pharmaceutical drugs because they're metabolized by the same enzymes that also metabolize other pharmaceuticals. So potentially you can get these drug-herb interactions, you know, so they are potential. So again, the WHO, when they did a report a couple of years ago, published in 2018, they said there's potential for CBD to be associated with these drug-herb interactions, but it wasn't clear whether these effects actually occur at physiological concentrations. Now, I certainly have read a lot in the epilepsy studies, and in these studies, the kids are usually on several different anti-epileptic medications, and the dosages of CBD are very high. And there have been some proportion of children where they've had some adverse interactions there, which have been managed basically by, you know, either reducing the dose or taking them off, you know, either. So I think it brings home, I guess, an important message. Really, when you're using it medicinally, it should be prescribed by a qualified medical, you know, or healthcare practitioner. I think that's probably the take-home message here, Molly.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, anything that alters your body, or particularly your mind and your ability to act, in my opinion, should be regulated and should be under advisement of someone who actually knows, you know, really what they're talking about.
Yes, that's right. I mean, but, you know, I'll make the point that CBD doesn't cause that potentially intoxicating effect of THC, and there are CBD medicines which don't have THC, or only have a very small amount, you know, of it. You can't say it's not psychoactive because it has anxiolytic properties, so it's clearly doing something to your mind, but it certainly doesn't have the effect, you know,
of the drugs, of the raw drugs, So do we have stats or actual evidence, science-based evidence, that shows that it is actually effective, and or at least as effective as the drugs it may be replacing?
Look, there is a lot of evidence, certainly preclinical or animal evidence, so we understand a lot about its mechanisms of actions in many different conditions in animal models. There is a growing evidence base of clinical research in humans. So the strongest evidence probably is around its use for chronic pain, chemo-induced nausea and vomiting, and spasticity associated with MS. There was a report done by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine. It was published in 2017, and it really looked at only randomised controlled trial data and what they call systematic reviews. So systematic reviews basically uses the data from randomised controlled trials, and it pulls the data and works out, you know, a simple yes or no, is it efficacious statistically speaking or not. So they only used that kind of evidence. They didn't use anything from case studies or epidemiological studies of associations and populations or surveys. They just say, no, we're just using RCT data and systematic reviews. So they basically concluded on the basis of this review they did that there was substantial or conclusive evidence that cannabis or cannabinoids were efficacious for chronic pain, chemo-induced nausea and vomiting, and spasticity, with MS, and they also said there was a moderate level of evidence for short-term sleep disorders associated with a number of other conditions. Now, I guess that's now 2017. It's probably getting a bit old now because there's been lots of research since. There's a fair bit of research in the epilepsy literature, for example. Lots of clinical trials have been done in epilepsy and CBD. So I guess, you know, it's a growing evidence base. And, you know, I guess, you know, it's just that we have not had access to it. In the US, they haven't had access to it, you know, easy access to it to be able to research it. So, you know, if you can't get easy access to research, it becomes difficult to actually do the research. So I think, you know, it's a growing evidence base, Molly. So watch this space.
Yeah, definitely. Certainly, I've known it. The epilepsy is a big issue and a big area where it seems to be very effective. And for pain management, it also, what I've understood is that it seems to be very beneficial.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
But you also mentioned a lot of other really good reasons that someone might take it or use it. Yeah. So you, I guess it's fair to say, can you get a high, or you can't really get high from using it if you're using it as prescribed?
Look, I guess technically you could get high from proprietary forms of, you know, prescribed medicinal cannabis, only if it contained the THC, of course, and you had a high enough dose of it. You know, if you're particularly sensitive, I guess, so that's why it should be prescribed by a qualified healthcare practitioner. But you're not going to get stoned in the same way that you sort of smoke a joint, if you like, because when you're smoking recreational cannabis, the amount of THC is much, much higher than what you're going to get when you're prescribed medicinal cannabis. So, look, some people have described a kind of a floaty effect with some of the products with THC, but it's usually subject to tolerance, or, you know, simply reducing the dose, you know, helps get rid of that. So, you know, it's why doctors start on a low dose and they increase or titrate the dose up slowly. So, you know, it needs to be under supervision of someone who knows what they're doing. And having said that, or look, CBD.
Sorry, it's frozen again, Kylie.
Try again. I'm just saying that CBD doesn't cause the potentially intoxicating effects of THC, but as I said before, you can't say it's not psychoactive because it can help reduce anxiety. So it's obviously having an effect on the mind.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess it's fair to say some people are certainly more sensitive to things than others, or more receptive to certain chemicals in the body.
Yep. Yeah, look, I've had Chinese medicine patients where I've given them about a third or a quarter of the normal dose because that's been enough for their body, you know. So this is why it has to be individualised to the patient. I mean, myself, I've got a very sensitive system. So, you know, for me, I would only take very small amounts of any kind of medicine because I am super sensitive.
Yes, understand, yeah. So what are our laws here in Australia around the medicinal cannabis use? And is it different state to state here, or is it just a blanket federal law that covers the use of it?
So firstly, just general use of cannabis, as in recreational use. It's illegal to possess it or use it in any state and territory except for the ACT. So they legalised recreational use early this year. And they've got a whole lot of caveats around that, and it's still illegal in any state to have any amount of THC in your body and drive. So, you know, even though they've legalised it there, they've still got the same issues with driving laws that any other state has. So our laws really, I guess, are twofold. We've got regulations around quality control of medicinal cannabis products, and we've got regulations around the prescribing of it. So, for example, with prescribing, only medical doctors are able to prescribe, and that does change from state to state. In Tasmania, only specialists can prescribe it, not general practitioners, whereas in the other states, I think, you know, general practitioners are able to prescribe it. So there's a difference there. Now, anything with THC in it over a certain amount is a Schedule 8 drug on our national poisons list. So that's a controlled substance. Whereas most CBD products, if they've got at least 98% or more CBD, they're Schedule 4, so they're prescription only medicines.
Right. Okay.
So we've got, as I said, we've got regulations around that because of being on a national poisons list, and that gets, I guess, adopted into state and territory drug legislation. So the states can adopt what they want from the national list, but by and large, they tend to adopt the national list. That's called the SUSMP, the standard for the uniform scheduling of medicines and poisons. So that's basically, our laws around it. And as I said, we've got regulations around the quality control. And I think this is something that Australia does really well. The TGA regulate the quality of medicines, including complementary medicines, very well. So, companies importing it or developing cannabis products, for example, they've got a fairly strict set of criteria, quality control criteria that they've got to adhere to. And they've got to be able to evidence it as well. So I think that's, one thing that we're doing well is to regulate the quality control of it.
Agree. That's one thing that we do have, I think, that shines is our TGA and the way we regulate things. Yeah. So is there a particular symptom or a protocol, a set of symptoms that doctors have to follow if they're going to prescribe it? Or, no,
not really. I suppose in Australia, I guess the TGA regulates, I guess, the prescribing of ways. So doctors have to apply two different schemes to be able to prescribe it.
It's just freezing again, Kylie. Sorry. Yeah, I don't know what's going wrong.
That's okay. I'll start
Technology.
That again. I know, it's fun, isn't it?
Yeah.
Look, under Australia, the TGA basically regulates the prescribing of medicinal cannabis by doctors, but there's no list of approved conditions for which doctors might prescribe. Unlike in the US, where different states have got lists of approved conditions, we don't have that here. Mm-hmm. Having said that, if you look at the TGA website, they do list various conditions for which it has approved special access B applications through. But it's really up to the doctor in consultation with the patient to decide whether medicinal cannabis might be right for them or not. And generally, the TGA recommend that other medications should have been tried first and that medicinal cannabis is not a first-line therapy.
Yes, okay. So what are the main uses of medicinal cannabis?
Look, the list.
Sorry, it's freezing again. I know. Okay, now you're back.
That's all right. I was going to say there's many conditions for which medicinal cannabis looks like it's very promising, and I guess there's a variable amount of scientific evidence around efficacy. Does it work or not? Now they did a study back in 2016, just when cannabis was starting to be legalised for medicinal use. It was done by Nick Lenceris and a group in New South Wales. And they surveyed people who were using it for medicinal purposes. And these people have been using it for, on average, about 10 years. And they said, why are you using it? What are the top reasons? And the main reasons were anxiety, back pain, depression, sleep, and neck pain, and PTSD. Now, when I look at some of the research in the US, the Washington State survey, again, done in around 2016, their top most frequently reported conditions for cannabis use were pain, anxiety, depression, headache or migraine, nausea, and muscle spasticity, presumably associated with MS. So there's lots of different conditions that potentially can be treated. So, pain, obviously, and we've talked about chemo-induced nausea and vomiting and spasticity and sleep disorders. Also anxiety and depression and PTSD look promising, epilepsy, neurological conditions, inflammatory conditions, arthritis, diabetes. So there's a lot of, I guess, potential areas where it could be useful.
Yeah, I think it certainly sounds like it'd be worth a few trials to see what did or didn't improve. So how do people get the medicinal cannabis? I know they have to go to the doctor, but would they would they have to have had taken the other drugs first, say painkillers, for instance, perhaps not have had success, and then can the doctor suggest taking the medicinal cannabis, or
Generally, most people have tried a few things before they sort of look at medicinal cannabis. And again, I guess that's the advice of the TGA. It's not first-line therapy. Other things should have been tried first. But I guess a patient might be philosophically opposed to, you know, using pharmaceuticals. Like myself, I probably would be. So, you know, I guess if you can, a doctor can justify that, you know, there is some evidence that it could be potentially helpful for a patient, and the other, you know, things haven't worked, or there's been unwanted or unacceptable side effects, and that's a reasonable justification. So I guess what happens is that in Australia, you get it prescribed by the doctor, but it's not as simple as just saying, you know, going in and seeing the doctor, walking out with a script. The doctor has to apply through one of two main schemes to be able to get it for a patient. So one is called the Special Access Scheme B, and they basically fill in an online form, and it goes to the TGA, and the TGA will then approve it, and then that approval will come back usually within 2 days to the doctor. If it's a Schedule 8 medicine, so let's say it's got some, you know, a reasonable amount of THC in it, and it's a Schedule 8 medicine, in some states, that form will also need to go to the state health department. So it's not one online form, so it would automatically go there if you check the box. And they also have to approve it as well. So that's the first scheme. So it means that every time the patient comes in, if they want to come in for a repeat, the doctor will then go through that process again. They'll apply to the TGA to have it approved, and then it'll come back, yes, approved, and then they can give the prescription to the patient to have it filled in a pharmacy. Whereas the other way that doctors can prescribe is that they can become authorised prescribers. That's another TGA scheme. Basically, the doctor says, look, I would like to be authorised to prescribe for these conditions. Let's say it's pain and anxiety. And and I want to be able to use these 5 products. So they actually have to name the products that they want to be authorised to use. Now, they have to apply to an ethics committee or a specialist college, but a couple of years ago, there really was no ethics committee or specialist college that were doing these approvals. And this is why I helped set up the process through the NIM ethics committee. So the practitioner will apply to be authorised for those conditions. They have to demonstrate that they know how to manage those conditions for a start, and that they've had training in medicinal cannabis. If they're approved for the use of those particular products and for those conditions, they get a letter from the ethics committee, and they then apply to the TGA with that as evidence, and the TGA give the final approval. So that means any time a person comes in with one of those approved conditions, the doctor doesn't have to keep filling in an online form. So it makes it a little bit quicker that way, but it's a fair bit of upfront paperwork to become an authorised prescriber. And the other problem is that, let's say you're authorised for anxiety and chronic pain, and then you decide you want to prescribe for something else. Well, then you'll have to go back through the ethics committee and then through the TGA. If you decide, look, there's a few new products on the market, I'd like to be approved for those now, not just the 5 original ones, then you have to then reapply to the ethics committee and the TGA again. So it's a little bit, I guess, a little bit of a clunky system. But the reason we've got those in place is that medicinal cannabis is an unapproved medicine in this country. So that's the only reason that it triggers the need for these 2 pathways to come into existence. So that doctors must use one of those pathways, I suppose. The third way is clinical trials, but most doctors are not involved in clinical trials, so I haven't really mentioned much about that. But that's the system at the moment, while medicinal cannabis is considered an unapproved good.
Okay. Are there many doctors in Australia who have started to follow the protocol and use it?
That's right. Yeah, look, there's about the TGA website, there at the end of May this year, I think there are about 89 authorised prescribers. And I think there are something like 46,000 applications had been approved for the Special Access Scheme B. That doesn't mean all of those are, that's not 46,000 people, because every time you come in for a repeat, that's another application. So we don't know how many, individual patients that actually means. And of course, if you're an authorised prescriber, you don't have to, the TGA doesn't report on number of patients seen by authorised prescribers. So we probably don't know the true extent of how many people have been prescribed, cannabis in the country.
Yeah, hard to get those figures.
Yeah.
So how long does a prescription last? Do they give you a prescription for a month or 3 months? Or
usually it depends on the doctor, but usually a month would be not unreasonable, because they want to monitor closely the patient. So I think that most doctors tend to be fairly prudent, careful with it.
Yes.
But I mean, I can't answer that because I'm not a medical practitioner.
Right. Okay. And is it expensive to get a prescription filled? Does it?
Yes, I'd say yes, it is. Some a month's supply might cost you 175, could be 300, and that's for just a month's supply. But if you're taking a high dose of it, then you might be up for a lot more than that. For example, kids with epilepsy, generally the dose for that is quite high, much higher than you'd use for anxiety and other and chronic pain and things like that. And so that can be hideously expensive. For parents of epileptic children.
Yeah, well, it could be expensive. So is there a rebate system? I mean, do they? No, nothing.
No, it's not on the PBS at this point. So, maybe that will happen in the future, which should be great. I think the first thing that they've got to sort of do is finally approve it as a medicine and stop calling it an unapproved medicine. I think that's one of the first steps.
Is that in the wind? Is that sort of something that's...
Not that I'm aware of. I think, there was a group of us that put in an application earlier this year to get CBD, cannabidiol, removed from the SUSMP and regulated as other herbs are regulated on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. The TGA at the same time put in their own application to their own committee and went up against that application to change it from Schedule 4. So it was dose dependent. So they had a dose cap on it, but changed cannabidiol from Schedule 4, which is prescription only, to Schedule 3, which is pharmacy only. So we won't know the upshot of that until the end of the year. But it'll be interesting to see the outcome, I suppose. I guess part of the bottleneck in Australia is that only doctors can prescribe it and some nurse practitioners. Other forms of practitioners like herbalists cannot prescribe it.
Do you think that would ever change, that herbalists...
Look, I think it should. Right? Personally, I think that herbalists should be able to prescribe CBD. I think there's an argument to keep THC.
So it's just stopped again there when you mentioned THC.
I think there's an argument that THC should remain on the national poisons list on the SUSMP because of its potential, sort of side effects. But CBD is, quite safe. The exception, of course, is that it can interact with some medications, but other herbs can too. So any good herbalist trained properly, and most people have to do a bachelor degree in herbal medicine or naturopathy to be able to practice, and certainly, it's a bachelor degree in Chinese medicine, they should be well on top of potential drug-herb interactions. And of course, the average herbalist is not going to be managing a patient with epilepsy, a child. They're going to be leaving that to the specialists.
Correct.
So I think with appropriate labelling, I think there is an argument that CBD should be regulated in the same way that other herbal medicines are regulated. That's my opinion.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with that. I think it's a valuable, very valuable product that seems to work very well in the human body because of the receptors that we've got. Yeah, and really, I like to see things like that available. But I think from my perspective, growing up in the 60s and the 70s, in the hippie times, I guess, the mental sort of connotations that go with marijuana or cannabis, it sort of takes me a little step to get past that, to think, well, this is really just a therapeutic product. It's got nothing to do with hallucinogenics, really.
No, look, you know, what people probably don't realise is that it was prohibited in 1937 in the US, but before then it was in very common usage. So medical doctors prescribed it. There are many, many different indications they prescribed it for. The American Medical Association tried to block that Marijuana Tax Act, 1937, but they weren't successful. And I think part of the history is, I mean, it's been used for centuries. We know it's been used, you know, 6,000 years ago in China, been used in India, you know, Egypt, even 3,000 years ago. There's papyrus that have shown a prescription for asthma, where they used to heat that and other herbs on a stone, and the person would inhale the fumes. And that's, you know, it's a bronchodilator, so that's why it worked 3,000 years ago.
Yeah,
but, you know, I think part of the history, at least in the US, was that, something I didn't realise, in 1920, for about 14 years, alcohol was prohibited. I didn't realise that at all. So I guess the regulatory body, once that became, you know, available again, they had to turn their mind to something else. And it was led by, you know, the head of that department, Harry Anslinger, and he turned his eye to marijuana and demonising that. So he was successful in putting through the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937. It was a progressive smear campaign by the Rupert Murdoch of the Times, I suppose, helped out with that. And they had all sorts of ridiculous claims about cannabis causing this, that and the other. And of course it became, you know, associated with the counterculture, Malcolm X and Satchmo and the jazz scene. And, you know, when you look at people who've been thrown in jail in the US, you know, for possession of cannabis and whatnot, they tend to be black people. And that's, you know, as I said, you can see the, you know, what the agenda was.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, when you look back over history? It's
been maligned wrongly. I mean, you know, the founding father of modern medicine, Sir William Osler, used to prescribe it. And Sir John Russell Reynolds was the personal physician to Queen Victoria, and he prescribed it for her menstrual pain. So, you know, you had the top blokes in medicine at the time in the 1800s prescribing it, advocating it. So, you know, people forget because, you know, they don't know the history of it, that it was in common use.
Yes, yeah, I think there's quite a few drugs that we have illegal now that were in regular use, medical use, yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? It's quite fascinating, the history of medicine and herbs.
Yes, yeah, no, it is.
Okay, well, thank you, Kylie. I found that quite fascinating because, like I said, for me, there's more of an older sort of view of cannabis in the terms of marijuana, but looking at it from a medical perspective, it has enormous benefits for the human body.
I think you're right. It has got tremendous potential, and that's why, you know, as I said, I'm fascinated. I'm very interested in the research. I'm becoming involved in the research side of things as well. And, you know, I hope that our government, you know, will support the medical research into this most valuable plant.
Absolutely. And I think too, if the situation that we're in today with all the people are so fearful and with the virus and all the lockdowns and so on, the mental health benefits, the anxiety and so on, it would be very valuable to use. Yeah. And I'll certainly look forward to your book coming out, Mental Health and Medicinal Cannabis. I think that'd be very valuable and very timely.
Yeah, thanks, Molly.
Kylie, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I've enjoyed it very much and learned a lot. One of the things I've found in doing these talks is that I learn so much. So it's a great benefit. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I know you're an incredibly busy person, And thank you for sharing all your knowledge and for joining us tonight.
Yeah, my pleasure, Molly.
Thank you. That's it for tonight, people. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your support at the Health Australia Party, and we look forward to having more talks. We've got a lot coming up, and thank you for your support, everyone. Good night.